Henry VIII is remembered for being one of the most notorious and brutal kings in history, and certainly the most horrific king of England. He was described as a tyrant, and he was a man who would execute 2 of his own wives inside the walls of the Tower of London. But despite the chaos and huge turmoil that he brought to the lives of the people during the Tudor period, Henry VIII died in a relatively state of peace and quiet. He was a man who'd been very ill in his final weeks, and his huge size and health struggles contributed to his death. However, Henry VIII made a number of requests for his death and funeral, and one of these was that he would be buried inside of the same vault as his 3rd wife, Jane Seymour, the queen who gave the king his greatest wish, his male heir and son. But Jane and Henry's burial vault would be disturbed a number of times, and their coffins could not have been in any more different conditions when the burial vault was opened. But what is the story of opening the coffin of Henry VIII's 3rd wife? Jane Seymour was a queen who was not as highly educated as the other wives of Henry VIII, but she is considered his most beloved. Jane was a peaceful and gentle woman who was seen as a good match for Henry VIII, who could rage very much. But Henry and Jane were betrothed to each other on the 20th of May 1536, a day following the execution of Anne Boleyn. Jane and Henry had been seeing each other behind the back of the king's 2nd wife, Anne Boleyn, and the pair married on the 30th of May 1536, and Jane was a very different queen as to the other women. She was not crowned because of the plague in London. However, Jane was a strict and formal woman, and she did not lead an extravagant household, which brought balance to the Tudor royal court. She was close with Henry's stepdaughters, but Jane did suffer a tragic miscarriage in the Christmas of 1536. However, when she fell pregnant again with the king's child, it would be everything Henry VIII wanted. During her pregnancy, Henry VIII pulled out all the stops for her, and she lived a very quiet life during her latter pregnancy before she entered her confinement in the September of 1537. But Jane gave birth to the male heir, Edward VI, at 2 o'clock in the morning on the 12th of October 1537, inside of Hampton Court Palace. Edward was christened 3 days later, and Jane was not there. But Edward VI was the legitimate son of Henry VIII, and he was so wanted. However, Jane's labour had been very tricky and difficult. It was very long, and it lasted 2 days and 3 nights, due to the positioning of the baby. But following Edward's birth and christening, it was then clear that Jane was not very well at all. Inside of Hampton Court Palace, in the very bedchamber that she gave birth to the next Tudor king, Jane Seymour died on the 24th of October 1537. There were differing causes of her death, including an infection caused from her placenta, or that she may have suffered childbed fever, which was sustained after an infection following giving birth. Others have said that she died from a pulmonary embolism, and Henry VIII was devastated by her death, and he went to Windsor, and the court were mourning clothes, and the king also spent a while in mourning. Henry did not have much involvement in sorting out the funeral proceedings, but he chose that she would be buried inside of Windsor Castle St George's Chapel. This was an indication of the king's grief, as he usually involved himself in planning huge ceremonies. On the 25th of October, Jane Seymour's corpse was embalmed and eviscerated. Her entrails were removed from her body, including her heart, and her heart was actually buried away from her body and was placed under the altar of Hampton Court Palace's Chapel Royal. She laid in state inside of Hampton Court's presence chamber, and her remains were then laid in a lead-lined oak coffin. On the 10th of November, the funeral procession arrived at Windsor at 11 o'clock, and they were greeted at the entrance by the Dean of St George's Chapel and others. 6 pallbearers carried the body inside, and they were met at the high altar by the Archbishop Thomas Cranmer. There were many prayers then made, and the body lay in state whilst the future Queen Mary I kept vigil over it. The following day further masses were sung, and on the 12th of November a huge ceremony was held to lay the Queen to rest with full honours in a burial vault beneath the Garter Chapel, which had been made for her. This burial vault was very small and would not be very big compared to others inside of Westminster Abbey, where royals were held. Following the funeral ceremony, the Queen's officers placed their broken staves of office inside of her grave, and the bells of London tolled for 6 hours. The burial process took an hour, as the vault was then sealed. The period of mourning for court came to an end on February 3rd, 1538, with the king confirming this. However, 9 years later, Henry VIII would also be buried inside of this small vault. When Henry VIII died, there was space inside of the vault for Henry, who had a much larger coffin than Jane's. Hers was dainty and small. It was never planned for Henry VIII and Jane Seymour to lay together at rest for long in the burial vault. There was no tomb or grave marker, but Henry VIII left instructions for he and Jane to be buried in a grand monument and tomb, presumably to be placed inside of Westminster Abbey. However, over the next few centuries, their burial vault would be broken into a number of times. The first time it was disturbed was following the execution of King Charles I in 1649. Charles had lost his head following his trial and the loss of the English Civil War, and because of the worry across England that his remains would be dug up and venerated, Parliament made the decision to bury him inside of the same quiet and small vault as Henry VIII and Jane Seymour. Because of this, the vault lid was lifted, and Henry VIII's coffin was moved, and this broke the trestle it was resting upon, so that Charles could be placed next to Henry. This was a Stuart king being buried next to a king that very much hated the Stuarts and banned them from ever becoming kings and queens of England. But during the burial of Charles, it was noted that Henry's coffin, which was much larger, was in a bad state, and much of the exterior wood was broken into, and some witnesses claimed that they could even see into the coffin and could see the beard hairs on his face which had been exposed to the elements. However, Jane's coffin was said to have been in a perfect state, and something that looked as fresh as the day it left the carpenter's workshop, being made for a queen. There was no sign of damage on this and no breakages. It was laying peacefully where it was buried over a century before. However, this was not the end of the breaking into the burial vault, as a child of Queen Anne, another Stuart monarch, was buried inside of the vault at the feet of Jane and Henry for some reason. So the burial vault was now very crowded, especially as it was only ever meant to house 2 people for a short period of time. But the final time the vault containing Jane Seymour's remains would be broken into was 1813. There was work being done to the chapel, and a passage was being made for priests to access the new royal vault. The old vault, containing Jane and Henry, was broken into, and it was witnessed by Regent George, the future King George VI, as well as other officials. They were looking to confirm whether Charles I's remains were inside of the coffin, and they did this by lifting his coffin and then also looking at the remains. They confirmed the damage to Henry's coffin, and it's believed that no repair work was ever carried out on this. However, Jane Seymour's coffin, around 300 years after she was buried, was still in a remarkable condition compared to the other burials in the vault, and there was still no breaking of the wooden shell, and it still remained on the trestle, and this had not collapsed. Because of the state of preservation, and also the fact that Jane would have had her body wrapped in cerecloth, a thick wax-covered cloth that preserved bodies very well, it's fair to reach the conclusion that Jane Seymour's corpse could still today be in a very good state, and it may not have decayed almost 500 years on. This is remarkable, considering she was the ill-fated wife of King Henry VIII. Jane Seymour, though, was a woman who was very different to the other queens and wives of Henry VIII. She was a calm and gentle soul, but a woman who did not opt for the frivolity of being a queen. She was practical, and she gave the king his male heir that he greatly wanted. It's not been recorded that specifically Jane's coffin was ever opened. However, it is noted that it was in very good state. But her burial vault was disturbed a number of times, and today it is marked with a simple engraved stone slab saying that she is buried next to her husband. the most notorious King of England, Henry VIII. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.